and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today we're delighted to be talking to Charlotte McCurdy. Charlotte is an interdisciplinary designer and researcher whose work focuses on making existential threats such as climate change more tractable through design. Her goal is to counteract the narrative of climate change as a problem without a solution. For her project After Ancient Sunlight, McCurdy fashioned a water-resistant raincoat from a plastic-like material she developed made of algae, which naturally sequester carbon from the atmosphere. The carbon-negative jacket debuted as part of Nature, the Cooper Hewitt Design Triennial. Fast Company selected it as the winner in the experimental category in 2019 Innovation by Design Awards, and it has been featured in the New York Times, The New Yorker, The Guardian, Wallpaper, Gizmodo, Grist, and beyond. Based in New York City, Charlotte is a partner of the One by One initiative with the support of Swarovski, the UN Office for Partnerships, and the Slow Factory Foundation, and a member of the New Museum's cultural incubator, New Ink, with the support of Science Sandbox. She's a 2019 Pop Tech Fellow and a co-founder of Co-Futures, a collective of futurists focused on directly impacting the world around them. She holds a Master's of Industrial Design from RISD and a Bachelor of Arts in Global Affairs from Yale University. Charlotte, welcome.
Hi, Pinar. It's really fantastic to be here and to get to meet you even virtually.
So glad you were able to join us. Please do tell us about yourself and to our audience.
Yeah, so my name's Charlotte McCurdy. I was trained in industrial design at RISD, but I bring also a global affairs background. So sort of thinking from that human personal experience lens, and then also from this very global lens, systems driven, and sort of supply chain and market driven. And that's sort of how I think, but probably why I'm here is I'm best known at the moment for my project After Ancient Sunlight, which is encapsulated in a raincoat that's made out of a plastic I developed that's made entirely out of algae, and it's carbon negative. And so I do a lot of work around trying to bring conversations around embodied carbon into the industrial design and fashion space.
Let's talk more about that. Why do you think that conversation is necessary? Like, what do you see as problems that exist in the design industry today?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I know that you structure this conversation around sort of a diagnostic and start from these problems, but actually I came to this sort of proposal, this argument, this object-based argument out of a sense of opportunity. So yes, embodied carbon in product has been a under discussed problem in terms of global emissions, but actually I'm most interested in making objects in that space because I feel like they actually help people broadly, the audience I get to reach through design, feel optimistic about climate change in a way that really abstract conversations about emissions can be super hard to hold on to. So instead, if I can show up and say, hey, you probably already think about plastic and know it's bad, but actually, if we take another second to look at it and we realize and think of it as being made of petroleum, most of it, it's made of fossil fuels. There's no way for it to be produced without being complicit in greenhouse gas emissions. And when we try to think about a decarbonized future, it's not just that the electricity will be produced differently, just very abstract. It's that the materials of our built environment, our skylines, and the things we put on our bodies are going to be different. And that they can actually, and so that the argument from the design perspective is that they can be beautiful and desirable, and that a decarbonized future is not just about sacrifice and penance and being smaller and reducing and being apologetic about your life. That doesn't have to be the way it is if we fundamentally rethink what we make our stuff out of. It can actually be not just less bad, but actually beneficial. And so that's part of where I show up talking about carbon negativity as in a net sequesterer of carbon. That as a way of talking to people about climate change actually is much more positive and hopeful. And to imagine giving a gift to someone that's not just good because it's less bad, but it's actually good, that changes the calculus and changes the way we can feel about fighting climate change in a way that I think makes it easier to engage in the conversation and keep people listening for a second longer in a landscape where we're flooded by concern. There's so much to work on and care about and worry about.
Yeah.
And to ask someone to do the exhausting thing of spending 10 more minutes being anxious about the reality of climate change, that's a hard ask. So instead, to frame it in terms of positive opportunity, that's sort of how I came to this, making this material, is because I found it let me have those conversations for a little bit longer.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I think you touch upon several so interesting concepts. So when there's a problem, there's always an opportunity, right? When there's a challenge, there's room for innovation, there's room to rethink things and do a better design. So I think approaching any issue with that mentality is so crucial for all designers, and it actually encourages designers to attack some of these problems or challenges in the world, because there's a big mentality also around like, well, it's such a big systemic issue, like what are we going to do about it, right? Even if like we might be an individual designer, we might be a small business, but there's always room to do something. And I think having that positive attitude really enables that. Secondly, by bringing it into such relatable product form really helps, I think, raise awareness and start a conversation. Because as you said, when you're having all these abstract conceptual conversations or highly technical conversations, it's really not like you don't understand it, right? Like sometimes we see like even more ingrained issues in our built environment because people, like, we don't understand our built environment or how it's constructed or the back end in the system. So the more it's complicated and confusing, the less actionable it is. But when you create this like very relatable product where you grasp like, oh, I've seen a jacket before, oh wow, like this actually addresses an environmental issue, I think it's so powerful that it makes not only like it doesn't raise awareness, but also it makes it actionable. So a consumer can directly be like, okay, I'm going to choose that product over this product because I understand the difference here. So it's a very smart like micro solution that you can send out into the system that is very dysfunctional and it could still work.
Totally. Well, thank you. But I think that you're pointing to something that is an important caveat to place on this, is that the raincoat is a tool for talking. It's a proof of concept of a way of thinking about materials. It's not a commercialized product that's available for sale tomorrow.
Yeah.
And the kind of work I hope that it can do is not about, like, it's not a vote with your dollars kind of argument. It's about how do we have these emerging technologies, this transformation that's happening in biotech, how do we make sure those innovations are centering carbon emissions? How do we center the opportunity on carbon emissions as we go? And I think you also bring up a good point in terms of the rationale in the project. When you look at materials that are intrinsically contributing to climate change because of their embodied emissions, cement is a way bigger player than plastic. That's not something that I'm disputing. It's 8%, depending on who you talk to, of global annual emissions are from the intrinsic chemistry of making cement. Cement, as you know, coming from the architecture side, is not a consumer-facing product mostly. And so starting from plastic, I felt like was a way that I could have a conversation with the public in a way that was more relatable and more meaningful to daily life than cement, which is super abstract. And buildings, you don't get a lease for an office space in a building based on the bill of materials of what it was built with 20 years ago. Like, that's not how we make decisions in that material space. So plastic, though it's not the biggest material contributing to climate change, was a way of making very literal and very tangible this question of materials that are carbon-based, that are currently contributing to climate change, that have to change if we are going to decarbonize our society. And there was another piece, you brought up at the very beginning of your comment about the how as individuals or as small entities, climate change feels like this incredibly abstract thing, and what can I do? How can I make a difference on that? And when I began this project, one thing that I was looking at was there's sort of all this meta criticism within the environmental space around sort of people making statements that like, we need new metaphors, we need new symbols for climate change. We need to stop talking about polar bears and icebergs and start talking about the way that it's actually in our lives right now. But I hadn't seen many examples of people trying new metaphors and experimenting with new object-based metaphors. So that's part of why I made it a raincoat, because at the time I was developing this project, it was hurricane season, and there was just so back-to-back tragedy, loss of life, loss of value, and highlighting that climate change is already here. It's already part of our lives in the form of extreme weather. And that if this is an artifact from a future, even if we fully decarbonize now, that extreme weather is going to be part of that future, unfortunately, at this rate. So how to simultaneously sort of talk about that reality, because also I find conversations about climate change tend to focus on apocalyptic narratives. And there's this magical, the curtain will drop now in 11 years. And then it'll be over, game over. And there'll be and it's like, no, it's actually like going to be protracted suffering for billions of people. And maybe that's darker, but I feel like that's more, you can sink your teeth into that and do work on that. Even if it's just a little bit at a time, even if it's just you as an individual brand just asking the question about your emissions. And that's worth doing. It's worth doing that tiny little incremental thing if that's what you can do on the ground in your industry.
It has to start somewhere, right? Like you have to have those awareness pieces, even if they are just, showcased at a museum. It has to, like, the conversation needs to start. People need to start questioning so that you can actually have that conversation trickle down to the mass market and really like raise that awareness around the consumer mind. So even if you can't sort of vote with your dollars on that product, you will expect that on other products. So it actually puts all the big brands and corporations that are just seeking profit on the spot by making these efforts, even as like an individual designer or a small business.
And it also affects the actual cost of these technologies, right? So in working with this material, like often a piece of feedback I get is like, you should make bubble wrap. And I'm like, yes, I could. But when you look at the history of, say, solar panels, they spent 60 years being more expensive than conventional fuels. But it took 60 years of support and R&D and getting to scale. And now they're the cost competitive form of energy generation for 2/3 of the human population for new energy production. Like it takes entering the market, and for certain technologies, starting in a market that's willing to pay a premium is how it can happen. So fashion became a useful place to place this idea because it can be more patient as an industry, and there can be a premium placed on an idea and a value. And in terms of democratic accessibility, like we have to get to a place where the better option is also the cheaper option.
Accessible,
like it's accessible financially, but we can't get there right out the gate.
Exactly.
Even just because of economies of scale.
And I mean, I think it's also, okay, let's go back to sort of like, I guess, the corporate responsibilities and sort of like educating the end user, right? And how that makes a difference. I mean, one of the main reasons why we started sort of like, what's wrong was our sort of like internal research process, right? Like we ask that question and we do research. But the reason why we wanted to open up to public and have like public expert interviews and have public ideation sessions was more because there is no solution to any problem unless if we educate the end user. Because if somebody goes into the market like knowing, okay, this building was not built sustainably, or this wasn't fair trade, or you really took advantage of disadvantaged people while producing these. Like if we had that transparency and knowledge, yes, I mean, not everybody can go and buy the product that is more expensive because there is less support to, build in that economies of scale. At least we will consume less. Like we won't go and buy it just because we feel like it at the moment, because we will think like, okay, this is not ethical, or this is really hurting the environment, So that awareness, and, I'm even guilty of it myself. Like my awareness compared to, maybe like 10 years ago is totally different. And I consider myself to be a more educated person, but you really need to have those uncomfortable conversations and sort of do a deeper dive into the surface problems you see, right? Like there is a reason why climate change conversations happen more around the polars or like polar bears or like you said, like a apocalyptic scenario, because it makes it harder to relate to. We're not living in North Pole. Or like you're like, oh, okay, the world is gonna end in like 100 years. I won't be alive. But if you sort of bring the conversation back down to something that is really relatable or something that we see every day, it's a total different conversation. So yeah, I think like there is really that starting point, or like catalyst products, or even conversations that need to start to raise that awareness. So even if we can't like find accessible options immediately, we can consume less so that it will motivate or push the industry to support the designers or innovations that are really trying to do it right, so that they can incorporate it into the mass production.
And I think this is part of why I'm excited by the role that designers can play in this exact problem space, because to the degree that we see design as a process of making something meaningful, and that can be graphic or visual, or it can be in terms of affordances and understanding how to navigate space, making these sort of abstractions meaningful. The climate space, I think, is rapidly trying to untangle this web it's built of it's constructing itself as an expert domain problem, and one where you, member of the public, you're not a policymaker, you don't have power, it's very technical. And the question of like, there's something about asking the clarifying questions and translating things into objects and experiences that are meaningful. So to give an example, parts per million doesn't mean anything to a human primate-brained mammal. What is a part per million? No critique on 350.org, but to say that 350 parts per million is like this, I don't see that and immediately have like an emotional reaction that like, oh, good, 350, yes, good. Like that's not how we operate. And if we want to invite more people to the table on the decision-making that will influence the direction of industry and government, we have to make it meaningful, and we have to meet people where they are, and have that kind of humility, and to have that kind of generosity, and to not. And that was a process for me in developing this project, is like, there's a gatekeeping that happens around jargon and vocabulary. And it's very inviting once you've got the language. And then you're like, now I'm in the club, and now I've done the work to be in the club, and I can keep people out. But
in architecture, oh my God.
But to actually solve some of these entrenched problems, that's just recapitulating, reinforcing the problem. And so how do you,
exactly.
So I'm interested in designers and artists working on the question of climate change because their capacity or training on asking why and asking for clarification and asking for the connections and translating it and spelling it out in ways that are crossing mediums perhaps, or speaking to different parts of human experience. I do think that that's important work for breaking open some of these problems.
%. And to the point where you talked about like, going beyond boundaries and doing like the cross-pollinated work and interdisciplinarity is so crucial. And it's interesting, although, we're like designers and creatives, in some segments of it is still very narrow, like in architecture, even though the nature of architecture really calls for working with different disciplines, it's not necessarily cross-disciplinary like design. We like see this firsthand because, sometimes we have people like reaching out to us interested in the podcast, and because we're an architecture firm and we have a podcast, and they're like, which episodes are the ones about architecture? And we're kind of like, everything we talk about relates to architecture, but and these are like maybe publications of magazines, which speaks to all these publications out there that just show pretty images of buildings but really don't question things. So I find it fascinating where, like, even though we are a very creative space, that multidisciplinary collaboration is not necessarily happening enough. And if it were to happen, we wouldn't be at this place at the year of 2020, I think. Like, you are not a fashion designer, but as an industrial designer, you're seeing a great opportunity where how fashion is a common thread in all of our lives.
Yeah.
And it really starts a conversation where, if you had started with something else or a very industrial item, like, it wouldn't have had the same impact. That's why I really appreciate your work, and I see it very crucial for all designers to sort of think outside the box and even collaborate more with one another. Do you get that often, like, because you technically designed a raincoat, it was the approach by like, oh, so you're a fashion designer? Like, do you see that, boxing in?
I actually I spend more time correcting people who call me a scientist. And that I find very interesting. And I'm always very careful about that, because a big part of this process was talking to a lot of degreed credentialed scientists who are very cynical and roll their eyes at a lot of design projects that touch the sciences. And so I really wanted to be accountable to that critique and make sure that I was doing something that was worthwhile. So it's interesting to me that the moment I step into these kinds of domains and I start talking about the carbon cycle and I start talking about, people want to call me a scientist, where I'm a designer, and actually I'm not doing any basic science. I'm translating some science. I'm asking questions. I'm proceeding in a methodical manner. But it's interesting that people are very unwilling to call me a designer when what I see as what I'm doing is being design.
I feel like it also shows how, like, overall we're not in the mindset of like this, all disciplines should collaborate with one another to find real solutions. I think if we were in that space, it would have been like more easily accepted or like seen normal that you're talking about, like translating some information you've learned from scientists or just like by research and translating in design or in a form of a raincoat.
Absolutely,
architects should be talking to more historians, psychologists, same for industrial designers, and this is not common yet. And I think that is sort of the point of this, where like these sort of interesting comments that you wouldn't expect come by, because we're not in that mentality yet, where it seems like, tackling such big issues does call for that type of collaboration.
And actually, maybe I would add a wrinkle or a refinement on what you just said is that they're big issues, but they're also super multi-scalar. Some of these most sticky challenges. And so it's interesting that you get asked to stay in your lane as an architect. And it's like, to work on the issues we're interested in, operating only at that traditional scale doesn't actually let us do the work. And so with something like climate change, you're dealing with literally tiny molecules and geologic time and the entire crust of the earth. Like, and you have, if you're not systematically touching all those different levels and the human being who is in the middle of driving these massive changes, and if you're not operating at all those levels and designing a system that can play at those different levels, then you're not going to make the impact you need on that system. And so for me, I brought this up at the beginning, or I pointed it to it at the beginning. The raincoat is sort of the charismatic, glowing object that has top hierarchy. And like I use it to draw people into talking about all of these sort of these amazing things that I didn't know before I began this investigation, that I feel like people should know and be able to hold on to climate change through the conceptual reference points of objects, which are so much easier for the human brain to hold on to.
So speaking of, I guess, like what you're like working on, the things we're interested in or believe in, would you like to share some other projects or teasers that you're like working on?
So it actually connects to what we were talking about a minute ago. Right now I'm collaborating with the fashion designer Philip Lim, and technically that the body that's created that relationship, it's an initiative called One by One, where they're pairing innovators and designers. And I'm an innovator, but not a designer, I guess. But I'm not a fashion designer. And it's incredible to be working with Philip Lim and his team. And they're lovely and have been thinking about these issues on the level of industry for quite some time. But yeah, so we're working on something. Obviously, that project got a little bit disrupted by quarantine and COVID. So the timelines on that are a little bit vague. But that's exciting. And it is interesting that, like, because I made an object from fashion, I got a lot of incoming from fashion. Partly that's because I think as an industry, they were very concerned about sustainability in a way that other industrial design has not yet been sort of pushed to the same degree. And fashion moves so fast, and it's so values driven and image projection driven that I think they were just really quick to respond to that. Mostly I'm doing some other things with exploring some new techniques and trying to get into more of that industrial design side of things. That's pretty exciting. And I think more than anything, I hope that I can be, I'm not trying to make commercialized products. I'm trying to participate and help people, give people tools to be part of this conversation, especially as we have a lot of brands making commitments around carbon neutrality or even carbon negativity, and giving people the tools to hold onto those words and to ask the right questions about, like, are you actually eliminating your emissions? Or are you just buying offsets? What kind of offsets? Like how to actually cut through what is a lot of like gatekeeping noise of like, no, it's complicated. Just trust us because we want you to buy our product. So how do you give people, the public, tools to ask questions politely but firmly, because like we are pushing towards a better future for or a livable future at least, and we need to be, and we can't let ourselves delude ourselves, and there's a lot of temptation to do that. because it's scary.
Yeah.
It's understandable. Yeah. It's not because humans are bad. We're just doing our best.
We're doing our best with what we know. But I also, I love that approach because, you know, it's sort of, it is like taking an action, like being active about something. Like if you were to like, oh yeah, if I had this like production line or supply chain, or if I were a manufacturer, I would do things right. Like sort of instead of saying that, like you're like, how can I bring my knowledge and expertise to help companies really get there, which is very actionable. And it is type of collaboration that we're talking about. Like I love to hear that, you know, big brands like Philip Lim is actually collaborating with innovators that are also designers who are, you know, who have maybe more intensive research on some like or who can be more lean in doing that research and you know, trying to reach some solutions with it compared to a big company. And I think it calls for more and more like bigger companies partnering up with smaller companies to sort of create that healthy mix, because if we really want to drive solutions, there is no, I mean, yeah, you can start your own brand and like go commercialize and whatever, but it's almost like if everybody tries to do that, it's like trying to reinvent the wheel. Like there are manufacturing systems in place. There are things that are already there that can be more healthy. How do we achieve that? So those type of partnerships are very, very important. And I'm so glad to hear that there are brands who are actually collaborating with you and sort of you know, bringing that knowledge and know-how and experience.
Well, and that's actually exactly to the point of why I'm not trying to commercialize my particular plastic, because the timelines on that are so long. But if instead I can show up, so like, and sometimes I get the pushback of like, well, if that's carbon negative, then any bio-based plastic is carbon negative. I'm like, no, it's not if the factory that ran it was based on fossil fuels. But you're right that that's the opportunity.
Yeah.
That if you're making lyocell or tencel in a factory that's entirely renewably powered and your feedstock is all renewably sourced and certified, then we're starting to talk about totally like inverting the carbon consequences of these materials. So like, I don't want to like go into my own little silo.
Yeah.
And 10 years later, maybe have a product. I want to sort of be talking about this idea so that existing systems that are already working really hard to increase their efficiency and the renewability of their energy inputs, if we can start to talk about the feedstocks, which for a lot of businesses are the most significant part of their carbon footprint right now, because we've gotten the story about electricity and fuel, like we've been talking about that for 20 years in terms of climate change. And now we're at a point where like, that's great, but if you have polyester coming in the front, you're contributing to climate change, and you don't have to be. And like that's the sort of frame shift I'm trying to talk about. And
that's why there has to be more mix of the perspectives of different industries, so that we can achieve that in industrial design, we can achieve that in architecture.
Right, because we're all sort of codependent on each other as industries as well.
Yeah.
I want to touch on consumerism, and fast fashion sort of brings up a thread for me, which is part of what gets challenging about working in the sustainability space is that there are so many different vectors of sustainability. So whether a material performs well on water consumption versus carbon emissions versus how they treat their labor versus, there's all the different vectors. And oftentimes we sacrifice the good for the perfect, and we don't get the perfect. So like a new material comes out, and if you care about climate, let's say you care about carbon emissions, and then the critique is, but what about your water? And it's like, thanks for caring and thanks for asking questions, but it's much easier to critique than create. And how do we have each of these technologies be stepping stones to that more complete universe, while acknowledging that we can't just teleport to a utopia? And so I bring this up in part because with my material, the very first question that comes up generally is, but is it biodegradable? And that's the voice I read all of the comments on Instagram in. Because yes, it is, but that's not what it's about. And there are a lot of biodegradable plastics out there, and there's a lot of emphasis and talking about biodegradability. But if I'm going to be provocative here, in America, we have 100 years of landfill. We don't have 100 years to deal with climate change. And yes, I'm glad people work on and care about biodegradability and ocean plastic and all those concerns. Climate change is killing marine ecosystems faster than ocean plastic is. Ultimately we have to prioritize. And what I'm trying to do is show up and talk about climate change. And even though it's incredibly abstract and scary, and it's much more abstract than a turtle with a straw in its nose, banning straws is not going to help us with climate change. And in fact, oh no, I'm gonna start chit talking now, and I really can't. I don't even know if you bleep. I'm sorry. But yeah, so that's the real talk. So I'm trying to show up and be talking in terms of carbon and be centering carbon, because I think, as we've seen in the cascading crises that we're in right now, what's sustainable? What are we sustaining? That wasn't working. Yeah. We need a new system that is actually restorative. Exactly. We need to be healing and growing something new. We're not just treading water on that old system. We can. Yeah. It's just not gonna happen. So
we have to fix what we did in the past too,
right? Which is part of why having the material be carbon negative is critical, because there's already too much carbon in the atmosphere.
Exactly.
For a livable future. We need to be taking carbon out of the atmosphere actively, which is also part of why the language piece is important, because
but it also starts somewhere. Okay, fine, you're very passionate about being biodegradable.
Sure.
Are all your products biodegradable? I'm sure it's not. The person who's critiquing, I don't know, there's always these naysayers who are sort of oh yeah, she did that, but it's not out in stores, or you can't buy it, it's too expensive,
right?
Or but well, what are you doing? There are so many problems in the world. Start somewhere. It can be about inclusion, it can be about addressing another social issue, it can be about environment, but you can start somewhere. If everybody at least started somewhere, we wouldn't be in this place anyway, instead of questioning this innovation that can really inspire supply chains or corporations, and you're starting off with oh, but is it this? It's not going to help.
And again, my response to these people is always thank you for asking questions, because really
okay,
those are great people. Those are great people. Thank you for asking questions, especially if they frame it as a question.
If they frame it as a question, I think that's critical though.
Thank you for asking questions, sincerely. And one thing that's inspiring about climate change, really cynically, this is flatly optimistic, but we have the capacity to change the atmosphere. So let's get good at it.
Just do it.
We have 7.7 billion people. And if we all start somewhere, that's a massive force of energy.
Yeah.
That's incredible. And we just need to do it in a way where we're accountable and responsible to each other and taking care of each other. And good intentions obviously are not the same as impact, but how do you start somewhere and create a system where you have a feedback loop where you can understand your impact and adjust going
exactly
forward?
How can I better my product, right? I think you're right. Asking, getting questions from people is it's helpful, but also the mindset of people is really important. Are you asking the question just to sort of for purpose of criticism, or are you really trying to understand where we stand in that conversation is really, really important. If you are a massive retail chain and if you want to eliminate plastic use, start with straws, but what's next? That can't be your 2020 goal or 2025 goal, which also might raise other issues, right? So I think Starbucks got a lot of, bad reaction from like people with disabilities that actually may need to use
Yep.
straws. So what is your like more sustainable solution to this rather than just like eliminating? Like if we're going to talk about sustainability, what would sustain in the long run
Yep.
and actually work for everyone, right? So, but it has to start somewhere at the very least. That's why it's really
Right.
hard for me to say like, I mean, that's not going to change anything. Maybe it won't, but maybe some people weren't even aware of the plastic issue, right? So it's like people need to be acting on it. I think that's like the bottom line.
Yeah.
And I think as designers, we have the biggest responsibility to do so because we can question and maybe do something about it and present something that might create that awareness that is lagging or push some others to innovate, really.
Right. Yeah. And that's part of why I came to design, is because on a challenge like climate change, for instance, and many others, the problem is not lacking technology.
Yeah.
It's that we lack political will. And the best way that I know of, to gain consensus and focus and get people lined up and pulling in the same direction is to have that vision, that prototype, that rendering that we've all looked at and talked about and been like, yeah, actually that is better than the status quo we have now. Mm-hmm. Which is in the climate change space that often the conversation is framed about in terms of loss, which we know from psychology is, as a species, we're super loss averse. So if you say you're going to have to give up X, Y, and Z, and you don't give people what they're going to replace it with, it's very difficult to get people to budge.
Exactly.
And so I do think, yeah, designers have that sort of dual capacity to like ask questions and to make these prototypes that sort of test reality and learn these unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And help coordinate vision and will. And that is a huge responsibility because it makes design sort of a soil in which the seeds of potential futures sprout.
Yeah.
And those seeds come from technologies and institutions, but how they're framed and nurtured and shared and discussed is often what will determine what we build.
I think this is a perfect moment to sort of tie into the advice piece where what would you suggest, or what would be your like 1 or 2 liners to someone, let's say, very passionate about climate change?
Yeah.
I don't want to say designer, right? Because I feel like everybody could be in design because we need the cross like collaboration between disciplines.
Definitely.
So what would be your advice to those who want to do?
Well, I don't necessarily feel like I'm in a position to give advice because I'm also just figuring it out.
We feel like you are.
I would say that to the designer in all of us, I would say that one thing that's helped me has been not just asking questions, but looking for the untold story. So if you show up and you're repeating talking points that are already well understood, you're not going to get listened to. You're going to get put in a box and people are like, oh, I know. That's part of why I don't talk about my material in terms of biodegradability. Because if I show up saying I made a biodegradable plastic, people are like, oh yeah, you're one of those. Great. Moving on. I understand. And it's like, no, but it's also about climate change. I've already lost them. So you have to start with a story. You have to find a truth. And this is not about making something up. This is about like holding on to this multi-dimensional gem of the system you're interested in and casting light on it in a way that it hasn't been looked at before, so that we can all look at the shadow of that crystal and learn something new about that system. That's a weird metaphor that I don't think works on a podcast, but I do think that that's part of what's helped me is not just critiquing what already exists and not just making something new, but making sure that the question that I'm asking, the story that I'm telling is unfamiliar enough to make people want to listen for that second longer. But also, this is maybe like a basic design Maya, most advanced yet acceptable statement, that it's familiar enough that it is connected to people's reality. So how do you give a gift of teaching someone something they didn't already know?
Yeah.
And how does that help them stay with you to learn more about what it is you're passionate about?
Well, it's such a beautiful advice too, because I don't think it's often talked about. Like, because when you're creating something, you're very passionate about it. You can be talking about everything about it. But to your point, if you really want it to progress in the way where it starts the conversation in the direction you want to, catalyze that conversation, you really have to think about the communication of that design and how we present it out to the world. So I think that's a very valuable advice that we don't often hear. So I think it's very important to any designer or people in design to sort of think about in order to make sure more and more people are aware or talk about the things that you want to point out and address. So thank you so much for that. That was great. And this entire conversation was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been super fun, Pinar.
It was amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you everyone for tuning in.
Thank you so much for watching this week's episode. If you found value in these conversations, please like our video and hit the subscribe button. Make sure to visit our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz, and subscribe to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts so you never miss an episode. Please leave us a comment or review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. You can find our handles in the description below. And don't forget to join us next week.